Well, welcome everybody and Happy New Year. Thank you so much for joining us. This is Jen Reed with the Science Collaborative, and I'm joined today by the Science Collaborative team here in Ann Arbor. You see Nick Soberall, Megan Brass, and Jane Ballard. We also have some team members from the Centralized Data Management Office on the line, and our NOAA Program Officer, Doug George, is also in attendance of the webinar. I want to let you know, if we haven't started recording, we should start recording the webinar.
It's already on, so good to go.
It is. Excellent. And we will post a copy of the slides and the recording to the Science Transfer Funding Opportunity page on our website. So if you miss something and want to go back to it, you will be able to easily do that. We will also add all of the answers to the questions that we received today to our running Q&A document. That's also on the Science Transfer Funding page. Just so as a quick reminder, all of the attendees are in listen-only mode right now to ensure good sound quality. But at any point during the webinar, you can use the question function in the GoToWebinar console to enter your questions. We will be addressing those questions that we received through the console first when we get to the Q&A session. The bulk of our time together today will be an open Q&A session, and at that point we can probably unmute everybody and take questions verbally. Okay, so let's we have a few slides though before we get to those Q&A time. So we're going to walk through basically a summary of the Science Transfer Grant Opportunity. That will include the timeline, the key requirements for proposals, our review criteria for the proposals, and then to help illustrate the types of projects that this RFP is designed to support, we're going to offer a few examples of science transfer projects that have been supported in the last few years. It should take about 20 minutes. And as I indicated, as questions occur to you, drop them into the chat. So first, to get started, we have a couple of quick polls to gauge our audience today. We're curious if anybody who's here has helped write a proposal in response to a Science Collaborative RFP in the past. So if you could quickly just pick yes or no, get a sense of where the audience is. So it looks like we're about 50-50. That's really helpful. Thank you for doing that. And one other quick poll, really getting to sort of where you are in your interest. So are you just getting up to speed on this opportunity? Do you have a couple of ideas in mind, or you definitely are submitting a science transfer proposal because you have a specific idea in mind? Okay, so about half of you are checking out this opportunity, and then the remainder kind of equally just thinking about a few ideas or have something pretty definite in mind. That's really helpful because I think you'll have a range of questions that will be good for everyone to hear. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more then about this science transfer opportunity itself. If we go to the next slide. So it is an opportunity overall that's meant to promote the transfer, use, and application of science. Projects that we'll support under this RFP can last up to 2 years with budgets up to $100,000 per project. Just be aware though that we're really interested in funding a variety of projects with a range of scopes and budgets. And to be clear that we really welcome proposals with budgets that are well below that maximum amount. So don't feel that if you have an idea that might not take the full 100K that you're not going to be competitive. You'll be very competitive. We really weigh the merits of each project independently. So don't hesitate to submit a proposal that might not be that full 100K. Looking ahead about key dates, the proposals are due in about a month and a half, February 24th. They need to be submitted by 11:59 Eastern Standard Time and using our online submission system. It's really helpful if you log into that system and begin that submission process earlier than that morning. It's helpful to get yourself registered and set up. You may have some questions and we'll be able to help you resolve those if you do. So please encourage you to get set up earlier than that. We anticipate going through the review process and knowing who will support by July and releasing funding notifications then. Projects will be starting October 1st of 2022. So the next few slides are really meant to help you get a good handle on what is science transfer and what's not. And I think, am I turning this over to you now, Nick? No, I'm still. So science transfer projects are a chance to leverage existing research and put that science to work really for the benefit of everybody that you're all working for and we're working for, in particular coastal communities and the ecosystems that surround them. The transfer element of a science transfer grant is projects that can support a range of collaborations and information sharing. We're looking for things that can for projects that will transfer maybe between programs within a single reserve. So perhaps from the research coordinator to the education coordinator or to coastal training. Maybe a transfer that's among 2 or more reserves. So some work that's been done on one reserve that another reserve is interested in working with their end users on. Or a transfer of information from a reserve to external partners. So you might all have some stakeholders or other partners who could use the science and you'd be working to transfer the science to those folks. Science transfer grants can support data analysis and the development of new decision support tools, but they are not intended to support new data collection. There are a few cases where data collection can occur, but that's when it's directly tied to an appropriate transfer activity such as a needs assessment or perhaps user experience studies or an evaluation effort that informs the development of a new program or a product. It's also possible that you might need some field or social science data collection that supports a training activity, or perhaps you need to collect some field data to calibrate a tool that you're transferring from another location. The RFP itself provides some additional guidance on this whole topic, and we're also happy to take questions during the webinar or over email later on if you have some further questions. So ultimately, science transfer grants are meant to help build a stronger and more connected National Estuarine Research Reserve network. This infographic sort of gives an illustration of how it can work really well. This illustrates a transfer of ideas that has happened in recent years around the topic of climate adaptation. And you can see that there's all kinds of interregional connectivity that occurs through science transfer. And that's the kind of thing we're looking for and we're excited to see. At this point, I'm going to hand it off to Nick, who's going to talk a little bit more about the specifics of what you should be thinking about as you develop your proposal. So Nick, off to you.
Thanks, Jen. Okay, so for the next few slides, I'm going to kind of walk us through just a few of the required elements, or I should say, I'll give you an overview of the 3 required elements for all science transfer proposals. So all the proposals, you can see this from the first slide here that we're on. have to relate to a science collaborative focus area, and they have to engage at least one reserve directly, and they have to identify end users and include at least one letter of support. And again, all this is laid out in the RFP, so I'm just kind of giving the high-level overview, but if you have any other questions, we can answer them in session, or you can check the RFP. So for this first requirement, all science transfer proposals have to relate to at least one of the collaborative focus areas listed here. These focus areas were identified by NOAA. Move my camera out of the way here so I can see my talking points. For the program for the next several years, so lots of projects can fit under these themes, but proposals should specify what the connection is within the actual proposal narrative. And the second aspect, reserve engagement, all projects funded through the Science Collaborative must directly involve at least one reserve. So that means that the proposed work plan has to actively engage the reserve system, and the managers of all reserves involved in the proposal have to be supportive of the proposed project. So the way this works, and it's a bit different in recent years, so I'll take a minute to explain it here, is that after proposals are submitted, we will reach out to reserve managers directly and confirm that they're aware of and supportive of proposals that name their reserve as a partner on the proposal title page. So if they have any concerns with either their engagement to date or the proposed role of their staff, they can complete the assessment form and let us know about those concerns. And those forms are submitted directly to us. So it's not something that applicants need to be aware, need to worry about, but you should be aware that it's happening. And it's your responsibility to engage the relevant managers early in the planning process and provide them with a copy of the proposal that you submitted. Even in cases where a science transfer project is led by reserve staff and will benefit users of programs within the reserve system, applicants should clearly explain how specific programs will benefit from the project and how individuals will collaborate to ensure the project is successful. Okay, so the third component here, collaboration and end user engagement. So end user integration is critical to all components of the science collaborative projects. There's a somewhat longer definition of end users in the RFP, but for a science transfer effort, we hope it may help to think about end users as the intended users of the project activities and products. So that's what we mean when we say primary end users. And our goal in emphasizing responsiveness to end users' needs is that it will help applicants be specific about who their users are and how those individuals will use and benefit from the work. So a few tips that I'm going to walk through real quick. And again, these are on page 16 of the RFP if you'd like to look at in more detail at them. But science transfer proposals have to include at least one letter of support from a primary end user. So again, that's somebody who's actively going to use, who's engaged in the process actively and is going to use the products directly. More than one organization can sign a single letter of support if their views are similar, so that helps you kind of cut down the number of letters that you need to go track down. So, you know, if you have a few end users that all kind of have the same, that are going to say the same thing in a letter, you can just write one letter and have them all sign it. And both the letter and the proposal narrative should explain how the end user has been engaged with the development of the proposal, how they see themselves continuing to inform the project if funded, and how they anticipate using those outputs. Reviewers will be looking for personalized signed letters on an organization's letterhead, so that it helps us confirm engagement and understand how the work will meet their needs. And as these are smaller grants, we encourage you to be targeted and efficient in your approach. So again, more than one end user can sign one letter. And we encourage you to focus on a couple of primary end users for that reason. And when you're identifying your primary end users, we encourage you to be as specific as you can. So rather than saying something like educators, you might specify education coordinators at these 3 reserves, or middle school science teachers in this state. And it's appropriate to think of the reserves as one of your end users, but they may not be the project's primary end user. And one more important note, this is just something we're kind of noting this year, emphasizing this year. If someone on your team is going to plan to contribute personnel time, but isn't funded in the budget, you should still specify an estimated full-time equivalent for the individual's time and confirm that participation in the project would be part of their work commitment. So these FTE estimates aid the panel when they're reviewing the proposal and assessing feasibility. Okay, so proposal evaluation criteria. So these are the criteria on the screen right here. All science transfer proposals will be reviewed by a multidisciplinary panel composed of collaboration, communication, education, and outreach experts that have some experience with coastal science management. Panelists will complete a written review of proposals and then come together to discuss and rank the proposals based on the recommendations for funding. And applicants will receive a copy of those written reviews as well as a summary of the panel discussion, and the panel discussion summary should help resolve any major differences in the written reviews and also offer some constructive feedback to the proposing team. Proposals are evaluated based on the 5 topics listed here. For each topic, there are 1 to 4 specific evaluation questions, and reviewers have to provide a score for each question. So reviewers will be asked to respond to 4 questions about a project's feasibility, including questions with the team, timeline, and budget. So that goes back to the FTE thing I mentioned a moment ago. And the exact language of each evaluation question is included in the RFP, so you don't have to guess what they are. They're in the RFP. It might also be helpful to note that we equally weigh each of the 13 evaluation questions when developing a summary score. So that means that those evaluation criteria that have more questions, such as feasibility, play a bigger role in determining a proposal's overall score. And again, the whole process is outlined in the RFP, but you can let us know if you have more questions. And I think with that, I'm going to pass it to Megan, and she's going to walk us through some project examples.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So what's fun about the science transfer program is that it can support a really wide range of activities, ranging from targeted data synthesis kind of exercises to things like innovative regional summits, and kind of makes it really hard to zero in on one perfect example of a science transfer project, because there are so many varieties of science transfer. But with that in mind, I do want to just take a moment to give a couple of examples of what prior science transfer projects have looked like, to give you a flavor of what we're talking about here. This slide highlights the first one I wanted to emphasize or to share with you. So this project looked at coastal impacts of climate change and how to spread the reserve's ability to help teach about that with their peer educators in the community. And this project was led by the education coordinator from Wells Reserve in Maine, and funds through the science transfer program enabled the education coordinators at the 4 New England reserves to work together to develop new lessons and lead teacher training workshops about climate change for their local coastal habitats. So in these photos, you can kind of see some of the examples of what they were up to. One lesson used classroom materials to demonstrate how surface elevation table equipment works, which was a relatively new addition to reserve monitoring programs. As with many projects, many of these science transfer projects, they're kind of multiple layers of transfer of information that happened. That's kind of what's labeled here at the bottom of the slide. So there was some transfer happening across sectors. The work fostered collaboration between reserve educators and the stewardship coordinators, and also the research coordinators. So they worked together to develop, to incorporate current data and new monitoring methods to develop the curriculum. So that was a cool transfer of activity and coordination of effort that came out of this project. Transfer also happened across reserves. As I mentioned, 4 New England reserves were working together to develop the curriculum. And then there was also the transfer of information to external partners. So these reserves identified partners like middle and high school science teachers that they wanted to be able to transfer information to. So they developed the curriculum in close coordination with one another, and also these end users, and were able to ultimately transfer training to those teachers. So you can kind of think of the reserve educators as the primary end users of the work, and then the classroom teachers as kind of the secondary or ultimate end users in this situation. So that's one example of a project. If we move on to the next slide, I can highlight another example that was quite different. This project up in Alaska with the Ketchikan Bay Reserve was led by the Coastal Training Program coordinator there. And this project focused on the transfer of a new tool from a Sea Grant program in the Gulf to Alaska. So this tool was developed in the Gulf by Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant, and then was taken up and transferred by to the Alaska Ketchikan Bay Reserve. This is actually something that had been transferred from the Gulf to Wells Reserve in Maine as well. So the Ketchikan Bay Reserve also decided this is a great opportunity and they wanted to pursue it with transfer funds. So the grant supported the team's work to conduct interviews and focus groups with their fishing community, and also fishery industry leaders to be able to adapt and customize this kind of fisheries business self-assessment tool for use in Alaska. The collaborative process and the new tool are enabling the reserve to better serve key user and partner, the fishery industry leaders and businesses. And just to kind of be really explicit about what the transfer activity looked like, it was the transfer of information that was kind of two-way transfers between a variety of external partners in the reserve. So as I mentioned, between the Sea Grant program and Kachemak Bay Reserve, and then also from Kachemak Bay Reserve with this new tool to their external partners. So those are the two examples we wanted to highlight. We thought we'd also round out this kind of Q&A webinar with some proposal tips. These are tips that we tend to provide to all of our applicants because they're common elements of all the types of projects that we support and can be really useful to keep in mind as you're working towards developing your proposal. These are kind of just laid out here to kind of follow the setup of the narrative that we lay out in the RFP. So the first section is related to talking about your objective and end user need. We just really want to emphasize the importance of keeping it simple and clear and focused, really finding a way that works well for you to kind of just in an organized way identify those primary end users the work is meant to support and state their connection to the focal issue, those issues that Nick flashed on the screen a little while back, those science collaborative focal issues. Be really specific about how the user will benefit from the project. We found that sometimes it can be helpful if you have a lot of end users to maybe organize this information in a table to help clearly convey individual end users' specific interests in the project. When you're describing your approach, of course, you need to be specific about the technical methods, but also your approach for fostering that really strong communication and collaboration with your users, that consultative part where you're working with them to understand their need and make sure that work is meeting their needs. So be really specific about your approach and then explain why, if you can, why your particular approach is appropriate. So if you're proposing to do a focus group, explain why that focus group is needed, or if you're building on, or if you're engaging in an existing group, explain why that existing group, that convening group is sufficient to be able to engage the end users appropriately for your project. Get specific about how you're going to solicit input from end users. Being clear about those details will help you demonstrate, how decisions within the project are going to be influenced by your end users. And then, just keep in mind, helping the reviewers understand the rationale for your approach is really valuable. It'll help them help to convince them that you'll be able to achieve your objectives. The next section is outputs and outcomes that you'll be asked to talk about in your proposal. Make sure you distinguish between the two. So outputs are those specific products or events that you can point to that you're planning to implement throughout the course of the project, and outcomes are those bigger impacts that you're trying to achieve. It's really important to take the time to connect the dots between the outputs and outcomes. So name the primary end users and their needs, be specific about how those outputs will benefit those users, and then also how those outputs will lead to the desired outcomes. And then it's easy as you're immersed in thinking about it, but just be careful to step back and make sure that you're not assuming that reviewers are going to understand something that's only implied or vaguely or loosely connected. When you get to the team section, this is kind of the fun part where you get to explain why your team is well suited to complete the work. This should explain the roles of your individual team members, and then take advantage of the space we give you to provide CVs and make sure they're customized to help demonstrate that those individuals are the right individuals with the right background to do the work. And just kind of one final note about the proposal. Make sure you pay attention to overall proposal presentation. Please adhere to our guidelines in the RFP. We do have formatting requirements because it makes it easier for reviewers to do their job of making sure you've set out to do all the things we've asked you to do in your proposal. And then, of course, as you might expect, if you've got sloppy formatting or lots of grammatical mistakes, they won't review as well, even if you have a compelling idea. So don't forget to double check spelling and things like that. Quickly, before we wrap up here and point to a few resources and support that we have, I just wanted to point out a couple of tweaks we made this year to the RFP. Hopefully you all saw the amendment from December 16, which provides some details about helping you to better anticipate and plan for some required programmatic activities of all of our grantees. So more specifically, we do have a quarterly workshop series that we expect you to attend, and also some semi-annual project check-ins. So that's all detailed in the RFP now. It has implications potentially for your timeline and your budget, so please plan accordingly to be able to do those things. And as Nick mentioned, he mentioned in-kind contributions and the importance of spelling out what that looks like for your project, if that's the case. We spend a little more time in the RFP to build out guidance for how to explain in-kind contributions of personnel. Reviewers are looking for the same level of detailed explanation for in-kind contributions as they do for budgeted contributions. They want to confirm that the time and personnel are there to do the work. And so we've added some guidance to help you do that, provide those details a little bit better this year. So pay attention to those and please provide those details if that's relevant for your project. So this slide here summarizes some resources available to you as applicants. It's never a bad idea to kind of peruse the science transfer projects that have been funded in the past to get a sense for the variety of things that have been funded and awesome work that's happened in the transfer realm over the years. Check out our archive of our webinar series. There's a number of science transfer projects that have been featured there that might be valuable to listen in on some of those. We also have some applicant resources. I'll just highlight a couple here that might be of interest. So there's one that we kind of call it's a characterizing end users kind of tool. It's kind of a series of questions that will guide you through a process of thinking about who your end users are, what their needs are, and then begin to translate that understanding into kind of an engagement strategy for going forward. We also have another tool that's set up similarly with a set of questions, but this time to work through alongside with your end users to make sure that everyone's on the same page about needs and what the project would address and how to think towards an engagement strategy. So take a look at those if they sound potentially helpful. We're always available. Reach out via phone or email if you have questions, and we can find a time to chat. With that, I'll hand it back to Jen.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you, Nick and Jane, who've been sharing some of those links to some of those resources in the chat. If you haven't had a chance to check those out, they're all there and pretty easy to access now. They are also all on the website. So now the chance to just ask your questions related to any of the content you've heard here or questions you have as you've been working through your project idea. I don't believe we've had any chatted during the presentation, so maybe we can just unmute and folks could ask their questions verbally. Can we do that?
People have to raise their hand if they want to be unmuted. I don't think I can unmute everybody at once, but if you want to, you can type a question in the chat, or you can raise your hand if you want me to unmute you, and I can unmute you.
That's good, yes. And there's already a number of questions that have been addressed in the Q&A document that's on the website, including from sort of past competitions. So chances are we've addressed your question already in some way, but please don't hesitate to drop it in the chat or raise your hand and ask to be unmuted.
Actually, Jen, I think we haven't added that yet. That was going to be a step after this webinar, but yes, there'll be some commonly asked questions that we'll be adding here shortly.
I guess the other thing to mention is, as Megan has made clear, I think in her comments, and I did up front, that we're available subsequent to this. So there's lots of time to think of questions, or if questions come up, there would be a great opportunity to ask those of us via email. So don't worry if you haven't had a chance really to think through what your project idea is. There's still lots of opportunity to connect with us before the due date. Okay, looks like we have a question here. So this is a good question. The question is whether a university can lead a project or if the reserve should lead the project. Either is appropriate, and it might depend upon exactly what the project is meant to do. So you could imagine there would be instances where it makes more sense for a specific reserve to lead a project. And then there would be instances where it might make sense for the university because perhaps the PI is the person who generated the information that's being transferred. So I think that can be determined in consultation with the reserves with whom you're wanting to work. And those partners should figure that out kind of on a project by project basis. So another question related to team composition. Does it make sense to have a single PI and maybe working with reserve staff, or is it appropriate to have a couple of co-investigators? These are great questions, and we encourage teams to put together the proposal that makes sense and the team that makes sense to carry out that work. So it may be that there could be several folks from outside the reserve, whether they're from a university or maybe a partnering nonprofit or something else. It makes sense for them to be on the team and lead the proposal, or it makes sense just to have a single investigator. It really will vary from project to project, and the reviewers will be looking for what makes sense within the context of the project. Is the team appropriate? Have they got the right amount of time for the individual team members? Do they have the right expertise? So that's really the way you should be thinking about putting your team together. That your team is well suited to do the work that you've identified needs to be done. So we've had a couple of good questions here, and we've shared information. As a reminder, we have a recording and the slides that we'll be posting to the science transfer page. We will be updating and posting the Q&A, the running Q&A related to this opportunity. We're available for any questions that occur to you as you're putting your proposals together. But we don't want to necessarily keep you all sitting here if you don't have further questions. We do appreciate that you've participated and came and listened, and we're really looking forward to seeing proposals as they come in. As a quick reminder, we'll be looking for those proposals on February 24th by 11:59 p.m. And a reminder too to make sure that you've logged in to the online submission system well before that day, so that you've managed. There's a few technical things you need to do so that you're able to submit your proposal smoothly, and we can help you in advance if you need that help. So I'm going to ask Megan, Nick, Jane, is there anything further that we want our potential applicants to know? I don't think so.
Just that we're looking forward to receiving them, and feel free to reach out with questions if you have them.
Well, that's great. So thank you all for attending today. We really appreciate your interest in the opportunity, and we look forward to seeing your proposals. So enjoy the rest of your day.